Hey, everybody. Time for my final um, lecture for our final reading of the semester. As you know, that's Aimé César's A Tempest, which is a rewriting of Shakespeare's original The Tempest. Um, I think César chose to call his A Tempest just in suggesting that, here's another version of The Tempest, and it's not um, necessarily the only alternative version, right? I mean, he's kind of writing from a kind of philosophical standpoint from which there can be potentially endless number of ways of reading Shakespeare's original Tempest, and therefore can be many possible alternative readings on Shakespeare's The Tempest. So his is called A Tempest. Um, and I hope you found it interesting. It's certainly the most contemporary sounding reading of the ones that we've done over this semester, which was because it was written in 1969, translated from the French. So it definitely has a fairly modern kind of feel to it. So let me give you some background first on Aimé Césaire and some of the kind of political philosophy, some of the post-colonial theory, and other kinds of philosophical or ideological elements that I think will be helpful in understanding what Cesar is trying to do and the kind of things that it'd be helpful for us to understand to see how he's trying to make this a rewriting of the original Tempest to bring out certain issues. And I'll give some highlights of those issues, not everything, but just some ways in which you can view it as fitting in with the kind of post-colonial philosophy or ideology, which again I'll talk about in a little bit. So first, a little about Aimé Césaire. He was born in Martinique. Um, here's a sort of picture so you can see where Martinique is located. Um, so we're southeast of Florida and Cuba, as you can see in the top right hand of the picture. Then we have Haiti, the Dominican Republic, U.S. Virgin Islands, and as you make your way down along those islands, you can see Martinique is the last one that's listed in blue there. So in the Caribbean, which, as we know, is also where the story is set. Um, Cesar has particular interest in questions about colonialism and colonial ideology and what colonialism does to the colonized and that relationship. Because Martinique was colonized by the French, and he actually lived under French rule for much of his life. Um, in fact, the original A Tempest, as I said, was written in French. So ironically, as he's sort of writing this as a critique of colonialism, he's writing in the language of the colonizer. He's writing it in French. And indeed, he did attend a French university in Martinique and then one actually in France. And so while he was, why he's getting advanced degrees and studying in France, he's actually doing writing poetry, essays, this revision of the Tempest, trying to make as a critique of colonialism, but doing it from within the language, the culture, the society of the colonizer, which I think is kind of interesting. And then in 1941, in particular, this is after France is collapsing. There were fascist elements in France that decided that they would come over on the side of Hitler and the Nazis. Some of them just to kind of protect themselves, and they became known as the Vichy government. They they um, they moved out of France and actually created some difficulties. They did have some military hardware, including ships, that did make it difficult for the United States, Canada, Britain, and its allies in their efforts in the Mediterranean to take back from the Germans northern Africa, Sicily, Italy, etc. They did actually have to had a bit of a conflict with the Vichy government at that point. So that was 1941. When that Vichy government, that fascist Vichy government, took over in Martinique, things became even more difficult, challenging. There was even more mistreatment of the native peoples of Martinique after that Vichy government took over in 1941. I'll also show you here a picture of Cesar, and it also comes along with a little kind of an explanation of what he was doing. He's very well known for the term, the concept of negritude, and what that meant in relationship to the Black Pride movement, the first major Black Pride movement that's identified as a diasporic Black Pride movement. That is, after people originally from Africa had been kind of dispersed around the globe, living in different places for different reasons. This idea of trying to have some kind of a sense of a cultural identity, and trying to do that, and et cetera, some kind of a sense of unity, being dispersed in various places around the globe. And so negritude was a term that was used for that. And as it says here, Cesar, a poet born in Martinique, coined the term negritude. When joining Cesaire A Tempest to found the Black Student, the goal was to reunite Black people who are considered French by law and nationality to their own history, traditions, and languages, to the culture which truly expresses their soul. A decade later, the leaders began to see the concerns of negritude as encompassing all persons of African descent. And that's getting into this larger, diasporic movement. Not until the 1960s was the concept further enlarged to stress the role of Black cultures on a universal basis. So Black cultures, as they had been influenced by other cultures around the globe with the diaspora. And so we speak of African American in this country, right? Recognizing the combination of certain elements of Native African culture with what we might call European American culture, right? Versus just speaking about African in general, right? And a good example of this is when you look at the arts, right? There are certain examples of the arts that one can even find in this country of African American arts, and actually quite a few people interested in studying African and African American art, but they're somewhat different, right? Because African American art is art that was created by people living in this country, right? Presumably having been influenced by and having assimilated to some extent to European American culture, versus what we might call Native African art, right? Which would express and represent more directly culture in Africa, right? So the arts are a really good place to kind of look at some of these differentiations and what it means, how colonialism impacts different cultures, is to look at the native artistic expressions, and then those artistic expressions after those places have been colonized. And then, there are attempts to try and recover certain aspects of the native culture too. That has also occurred in this country, right? In particular, movements to try and recover traditional African identity, traditional African names, traditional African religion, clothing, right? Those are things that I'm sure you've seen in this country that are more recent expressions of trying to, again, recover more elements of Native African culture. And again, as you can understand, that the arts are a great place to kind of look and see that. So that's what negritude means as a concept, and you can see another good example of this in the Harlem Renaissance that occurred in the first half of the 20th century in this country. And there were elements in the Harlem Renaissance of both African American culture and Native African culture that again included poetry, literature, the plastic arts, etc. Post-colonialism is another important term here. Obviously, I'll give the many different definitions. If you search for definitions of post-colonialism, post-colonial theory, and post-colonialism over and against colonialism, post-colonialism as one word versus post-colonialism, you'll find all different kinds of definitions. So I just wanted to choose one here that I thought fits well with A Tempest. So when we look at post-colonial theory, as it says here, focuses on the reading and writing of literature written in previously or currently colonized countries. The literature is composed of colonizing countries that deals with colonialization or colonized peoples. Certainly, Cesaire is writing from the perspective of somebody who has been colonized, right, as the French colonized Martinique, and has experienced that directly. And he's also writing about people, in particular, Caliban, right, who has been, in a sense, colonized by these Europeans, by Prospero and Miranda in particular. And so that's one of the things that I think makes this so insightful, makes it so interesting, is because the author is someone who has firsthand kind of understanding with, and a way of conceptualizing and understanding what the main character, as he sees the Caliban, is going through. And again, this is written from the standpoint of Caliban, whereas the original was written more from the standpoint of Prospero. And of course, depending on whose eyes you're looking through things, at things, that things are going to look different. And obviously, he also changes the characters somewhat to kind of emphasize that as well. The postcolonial theory is a term that refers to the theoretical and critical observations of former colonies of the Western powers and how they relate to and interact with the rest of the world. Greatly interested in the cultures of the colonizer and the colonized, postcolonial theory seeks to critically investigate what happens when two cultures clash and one of them ideologically fashions itself as superior and assumes dominance and control over the other, right? As both happened to Cesaire himself and as happens to Caliban in Tempest. The field of postcolonial studies has itself been hotly contested ever since its rise in the 1970s. And so you can see how this book coming out in 1969, the original French edition, is right at the time when post-colonial theory is really developing, right? People are searching for a concept, for a way to refer to literature and criticism, and a kind of a critical lens that looks at the impact of the colonized by the colonizer and all of those different aspects, what happens over time, and starts to begin to talk about ways of potentially trying to recover aspects of those people who have been colonized, aspects of their culture, their language, etc. But it depends on the particular culture you're talking about, right? If we're talking about cultures that came from Africa originally, as those become spread around the globe with the diaspora, and as those become colonized by the French and other people, that radically changes the culture in certain kinds of ways. And so trying to recover native cultures can be really difficult in their circumstances. Maybe the best example of that is Native American cultures in North America, right? Because not only were they, in a sense, colonized, but they have no sort of homeland to go back to recover their language and to recover various aspects of their culture and their way of life, right? Which they can no longer live, obviously, as largely nomadic people, et cetera. And there's lots of complexities tied in with Native American religion, et cetera. And as an oral culture, right, if they lose their stories, their traditions, and the way their identities are bound up with that, um, they lose it forever because they can't go back to text, they can't go to libraries, they can't go to um, repositories of knowledge other than older people, right? Other than their elders, to try and maintain those stories, that tradition, and the way their identities and language and all of that is shaped by those things. So um, it's this is all very complicated, and post-colonial theory, post-colonial criticism is going to look different and take different forms in every instance, just because um, every time we look at the relationship between a colonizer and the colonized, it's going to be somewhat different depending on where we're looking, right? And what cultures are sort of involved there. Um, Another interesting aspect of A Tempest is that it borrows elements from what's known as surrealism. I'm going to put a definition of surrealism up here. Um, As it says here, an art movement influenced by the theories of the pioneer of psychoanalyst Sigmund Freud. So definitely Sigmund Freud was a great influence on surrealism and all kinds of surrealist art. The images found in surrealistic works are as confusing and startling as those of dreams. Surrealist works can have a realistic, irrational style, precisely describing dream-like fantasies, or it could have a more abstract style. It depends on the particular piece of art or surrealistic artist you're looking at. Surrealism aims to eliminate conscious control in order to express the workings of the unconscious mind, right? So when Freud comes along and the sort of early 20th century and really starts to change the way people think about the human mind, and in particular, arguing that the human mind, the largest part of the human mind is actually the unconscious mind. It's not the conscious mind. The unconscious mind is much larger. And the way in which the unconscious mind is controlled by what he calls the id, right, which are these natural biological urges that human beings have, right, for food, for safety, for companionship, sexuality, all those kinds of things. And then as those kinds of things in the unconscious mind meet up with society and adults and parents, right? And then we talk about the superego as that thing that tries to control the id, right? Since we can't just naturally directly pursue our biological drives, right? And the negotiator between those two is what we know of as the ego, right? So those are the three main parts of the psyche for Freud. And surrealism really wanted to look at things more from a kind of subconscious or unconscious perspective, right? What's kind of going on in the unconscious mind that is really shaping people's behavior, their attitudes, their desires, um, as it says here, eliminating the conscious control of the mind to consider how the unconscious mind sort of shapes human experience. Um, and that includes human experience in very traumatic kinds of situations, right? Being colonized is obviously very traumatic. Caliban has undergone a traumatic kind of experience, right? Um, you see a lot of surrealist art, surrealist literature, surrealist painting coming out and really becoming popular after World War I because of the great psychological trauma that was caused by that war. And even into trying to have some kind of a way of depicting what that kind of trauma is like, what it does to the human psyche in a way that cannot be totally understood in just looking at the conscious mind itself, right? So people that have experienced great traumas, obviously we think about Freud, might undergo psychoanalyst to kind of understand how those traumas have impacted their lives and maybe cause difficulties, challenges for them. So they could try to come to terms with some of those things that then become buried in their mind and that they try to block out. There's certain healthy ways of of dealing with those traumatic experiences for Freud, at least more healthier ways. And then there are also very unhealthy ways. And that's what Freudian psychology really deals with when we think about psychoanalysts. I'm sure you have seen examples of surrealist art before. Maybe the most popular is the work of Salvador Dali, and this is his famous painting with the melting clocks that you may have seen before. Um, Surrealist literature might include things like A Clockwork Orange, lots of other examples. Um, so if you just go to Google Images and put in surrealist art, you'll see lots of different examples. In fact, the edition of Civilization and Its Discontents, a work of Freud's that my students read in Humanities 2, has a piece of realistic art on the cover. So there are elements of that, I think, that you can see in César's work as well, especially in kind of the dream sequences or the way that Ariel is influencing the thoughts, the experiences, the dreams of the various characters. A couple other things about some of the philosophical or conceptual ideas that Cesar's working with here. He's also using a version of the dialectic of the philosopher Hegel that I know I've talked about before. In particular, the relationship between the oppressor and the oppressed, or we could say the colonizer and the colonized. And in particular, the way in which from this standpoint that Cesar develops from people like Hegel, the way in which colonization decivilizes both the colonizer and the colonized. That's a real major theme in A Tempest, right? So that both Prospero and Caliban have been corrupted by this instance of colonization. And that comes out very clearly in the end of the story, in the way in which Prospero decides to stay on the island and feels that he needs to stay on the island, right? He has become dependent on Caliban for his sense of purpose, for his sense of power, his sense of authority, his identity. He's trapped in that relationship. He has been corrupted by it. The same thing has obviously happened with Caliban, right? And giving him a different language to speak and telling him he couldn't practice his native religion, giving him a different name. But notice how Caliban becomes more aware than Prospero is, of how he's been corrupted by this instance of colonization, and why he chooses to say, call me X, right? Wanting to get rid of that name that was given to him by the colonizer, right? Naming is very powerful. Ideologically, in terms of identity, people's sense of self, right? Because names have associations, they're tied with different kinds of social norms and cultural norms. So the power to be able to name things and name yourself is very important here, right? So just like Malcolm X, the famous civil rights leader, Cesar has Caliban say that, call me X rather than call me Caliban. He says, I'm going to practice my religion. I don't care what you say, right? He's definitely in this version of Caliban, we see somebody who's much more outspoken, going to stand up for himself. And in fact, he's much more aware of the way in which he has been corrupted by Prospero than Prospero realizes in terms of how much he's been corrupted as the colonizer, right? And been decivilized. And in that instance, there's a sense in which Caliban is sort of in a better position at the end of the story than Prospero is from that particular standpoint. That he has realized and been able to start fighting against the way in which he has been corrupted by the colonizer. Whereas Prospero just doesn't seem to understand that. And again, seems to be just so dependent on Prospero. But there is an interdependency that develops between the colonizer and the colonized, right? Caliban is still essentially a kind of slave to Prospero, at least in that he makes him chop his wood for him and do other kinds of things. Um, and you're sort of under the control. Um, and Prospero again is dependent on Caliban. So Hegel also talks about, and people who have used this kind of Hegelian perspective, about that kind of interdependence of the colonizer and the colonized, right? And that's in one reason that you can't just end colonialism really easily. Um, Obviously, big imperialist countries do not want to give up their colonies, but that disengagement is really difficult because it's changed both the colonizer and the colonized in very profound ways, right? And again, you have to look. You can make some general statements about that, but you have to look at every particular instance to really understand it well, because every instance is somewhat different. Cesar was also somewhat interested in and influenced by communism or Marxism, though he came to reject it, in particular because as Marxism developed, it kind of reduced that relationship between, from a Marxist or communist perspective, the bourgeoisie, the owners of the means of production in society, right, the factory owners, let's say, and the proletariat, the workers, right? And the basic dynamic there is that the workers are taking these raw materials and they are adding value to them by making products out of them. But that added value largely goes to the factory owners and not to the workers. That's one of the central dynamics of Marxism. And as communism is a way of trying to level the playing field, as it were. But in general, it tends to reduce everything to the material relations in society, right, to economics, and argues that you might see discrimination, oppression that has to do with gender or that has to do with race. But for orthodox or traditional Marxism, it all can be reduced to economics. Cesar didn't believe that that's the case. And most people today who might be influenced by Marxists, and a lot of people have, if you ever get a chance to read a Communist Manifesto, and I have my two students read it, you'll be surprised at how much of it has made its way into common parlance. Some of the concepts and ideas, just as also happened with Freud, in fact, and in the way in which it reads, at least on the surface, is very democratic, sort of, as well. But Cesar really believed that you can't just reduce everything to economic relations, as Marxism was doing, as orthodox traditional Marxism was doing. That you can't just subordinate race to class struggle, that you have to look at race in and of itself. And I think a lot of modern feminists would say the same thing, that if you're going to look at gender and oppression, you've got to look at gender in and of itself. Certainly there's an economic dimension to it, that's very important. Certainly there's an economic dimension to racism that's very important. And that's what's so tricky, because those things become so entangled, and we, in our own culture, it's very obvious, right? Women make less money than men for the same, for doing the same work and with the same kind of education. We know that schools that are attended by non-white students typically do not have the same kind of economic supports, et cetera, supports in the community, as schools that are attended by largely white middle class, students. So race and gender and other kinds of differences are tied up with economics. But most people today, to the extent that they would utilize some of Marxist concepts and ideas, would call themselves maybe neo or new Marxists. That is, they see value in the Marxist perspective and understanding the oppressor-oppressed dynamic as you see it in Marx. And that also could be traced back in certain ways to Hegel as well. There's definitely some parallels there. By the same token, they would argue that you've got to look at these other kinds of oppression based on differences, gender, race, et cetera, in and of themselves. Also, Cesar was one of a last real generation of theorists to also be kind of universalists in the Hegelian kind of tradition. That is to try and come up with a real holistic perspective on things. Um, what postmodernists often call a grand narrative. That is one overarching story, right? Which is very similar to having kind of a holistic perspective on things, right? That says, here's how you should understand economics, different kinds of institutions and societies, their cultural practices, the arts, all other kinds of things. From a more postmodern standpoint, people would argue that there is no grand narrative, right? That there are lots of competing narratives, and there are lots of ways to tell stories about things that have happened historically, let's say, right? So rather than saying that there is one um, holistic perspective that can help you to understand all of the events of the Civil War, right, which would be a very traditional historian's perspective. Today, we recognize that there are different perspectives, different experiences of the Civil War. And we wouldn't just read histories of the Civil War based on the autobiographies of the great generals or of soldiers who fought in the war. We would also use diaries written by women, some of whom were actually involved directly in the war. Mary Chestnut's diary is a great example of that. She was from the South, and lots of great insights and perspectives that you wouldn't get in reading other kinds of histories of the Civil War. The perspectives of Black people living at the time of the war in the North or the South, right? You have all these different perspectives. And so a more postmodern perspective says that you need to look at those as different perspectives, not try to absorb them into one whole. They all have something important and of value that we should try and understand. But traditionally, this more universalistic perspective and trying to become kind of holistic tries to put everything in terms of one overarching story. And it's, again, Cesaire was from the last generation of writers to really attempt to do that. Nonetheless, he was aware of the dangers of absorbing difference within these larger wholes, of absorbing the other, right? People who would generally be traditionally viewed as outside of the dominant culture, or the not a member of the haves or the culture of power in society. And so he talked about a kind of holistic perspective that was also rich with particulars, where the particular didn't get absorbed into the larger whole, but was still able to maintain itself. Now, there are arguments about how, to what extent that's really possible, right? To what extent can you really maintain in its integrity the perspectives of different, individuals or groups of people in telling a larger story about a big historical event, let's say. But that's what Cesar was ultimately, trying to do. Trying to, wanting to have some kind of holistic perspective, but wanting somehow to maintain difference, maintain the other. And of course, that's a balancing act too. Historically in this country, when we think about slavery, when we think about the way Native Americans were treated, the idea was everybody needs to assimilate to the dominant culture, which was European culture essentially, and Northern and Western European culture. And then we came to a time when we were really recognizing the damage that did, and we started focusing on otherness, right? On a multicultural perspective, on the integrity and the difference of other cultures that were part of this culture. And again, you can think of um, um, Native peoples in the Southwest and the Southeast, the way Mexican and then Chicano culture developed, and Native Americans and African Americans, all those sort of different groups. And the idea was that you really need to focus just on the otherness or focus on difference, and completely reject the assimilationist perspective. Today, I think our big challenge is we're trying to come up with a way of kind of doing both in a kind of way, trying to do to an extent, not exactly what Cesar was trying to do, but something like it, whereby we would recognize that there are always going to be a dominant culture, right? There always is going to be a culture of power in society, but trying to make it more internally diverse, make it more inclusive, make it not so much based on, white male European culture, history, perspectives, those kind of things. So having a dominant culture that's really much more pluralistic or heterogeneous, rather than having one that's much more assimilationist or homogeneous in orientation, kind of a whitewashed dominant culture, you might say. And you can see, I think Cesar is a part of that tradition. And doing that, it's in some ways it's always easier, at least kind of intellectually, to just focus on assimilation. You know, everybody needs to do what the dominant culture does, or in some way to say everybody go and do your own thing, right? Which obviously is very fragmenting. It makes people overlook aspects of their common humanity. The hard thing is to find that heterogeneous, pluralistic dominant culture perspective, right? To be able to combine a respect for and a celebration of otherness, and so that it doesn't get completely absorbed into the larger whole, but also have a sense of a common humanity. That's in some ways the big challenge of philosophy, and different kinds of critical ideologies today. Another part of this I want to talk about is the idea of false consciousness as it's tied to Marx. False consciousness is essentially when people who are colonized tend to believe that they deserve to be colonized, that they are indeed inferior, and where the colonizer believes that they are indeed superior, right? That's called false consciousness, right? And you can see the danger from both perspectives, and you can see how it plays itself out in The Tempest, right? Especially in Shakespeare's original The Tempest, you can see how Prospero sees himself as superior, right? His language is superior, his culture, his sense of identity, all those things being superior. And that makes it seem like it's okay to force your way of looking at things on the colonized, right? And you can see it from this perspective of the colonizer, believing that they deserve to be treated as inferior because their religion is different, and maybe they have a religion that has multiple gods, like a pagan religion versus a monotheistic religion. Monotheistic religions tend to believe themselves superior to more pluralistic kind of or pagan religions. To see themselves as maybe not advanced scientifically or technologically, and therefore as inferior, because the colonizer has weapons and technologies that allow them to have power over the colonized, that the colonized are somehow inferior and deserve to be. And of course, when you really think that you deserve to be, you're more willing to assimilate to the dominant culture. And then obviously you lose lots of elements of your native culture. So when you look at the end of Cesar's version, what you end up seeing is a Caliban who has been able to shed his false consciousness. He no longer believes that he's inferior and deserves to be treated as such, but Prospero still believes that he's superior. He has not shed his false consciousness. He's still under this false assumption that he's superior. So in this way, again, Caliban's in a better position at the end of the story than Prospero. Prospero doesn't realize that in seeing himself as dependent on Caliban and not able to leave the island, that he's being controlled by his relationship with Caliban. One other dynamic and way to see this is the relationship and the difference between Ariel and Caliban, right? We have Caliban as essentially a black slave now, and Cesar puts it directly that way in this revision of The Tempest. And Ariel is a mulatto slave, right? And Ariel again is told that he will have eventual freedom. He's treated better than Caliban, and he is freed at the end of the story. Caliban is treated like he's owned by Prospero, like he's always going to be owned by Prospero, that he can't survive on his own, that he's inferior, and there's no way he's going to become, independent. And you see there are different ways of fighting against Prospero. Ariel believes in a kind of a pacifist, Let's educate him to see the flaws in his false consciousness. Let's try to enlighten him, right, with ideas and with our actions and our behaviors, right? Caliban believes that Ariel's being what's called an Uncle Tom, right? Kowtowing to Prospero, and that they need to be aggressive, right? They need to protest. Um, they need to fight against Prospero. That Ariel's naive and thinking they're going to be able to change Prospero's mind and attitude, etc. That that being seeing himself as superior is so deeply ingrained in him because it's all he's ever known for his whole life. And it's reinforced by his relationship with Miranda. The Caliban is going to take a much more aggressive approach. Ariel's willing to kind of be nice to Prospero. Notice how he does protest when he's asked to do things that might hurt other people and more directly protest. Nonetheless, he doesn't, give any lip to Prospero. He generally says yes and no and thank you and does what he's told to do. Caliban talks back. He talks back in his own language, which Prospero tells him not to do. That really angers Prospero, and is much more aggressive in fighting against him. Just one other set of concepts I wanted to talk about here briefly has to do with the way in which colonized people are often treated as or viewed as exotic by the colonizer, and how dangerous and damaging that can be. Again, in this country, a great example of this is to look at the way Native Americans were viewed as exotic. And to exoticize somebody is to view them frequently as kind of less human, as in some ways inferior to the dominant culture perspective, typically whoever the colonizer is. To exoticize somebody. You look at them just in terms of their differences. That otherness tends to mean inferiority when you look at that kind of exoticism. And it's often also tied up with what's called spectacle. I think I mentioned this in my Shakespeare lecture, but a good place to see this are the Wild West shows that took place in this country, especially Wild Bill's Old West show. The Sitting Bull actually participated for a time, a few months, I think, when he really needed the money, where these, Native Americans and cowboys would put on these shows for Easterners, where they would reenact Native American raids on frontiers people, as they were traveling through the West in their Conestoga wagons, battles between government troops and Native Americans doing different kinds of dances, things that represented their culture. But it was all kind of a spectacle. It wasn't to try to really understand at a deep level and appreciate and respect their culture and the cultural differences. It was to make make a spectacle out of them, right? And create a kind of a spectacle conscious, which means to look at things in a very uncritical, superficial kind of way. So exoticism and that spectacle conscience kind of go together. And here you'll see an example, spectacle of race and the exotic in Disney's Aladdin, right? Disney films and the way they represent people who are not traditionally of Western European descent or from the dominant culture in this country. It's important to look, critically at how they are represented in Disney films. And you can look at Pocahontas, you can look at Aladdin, you can look at The Lion King. There are many different critiques of the way in which others had been treated in a very exoticizing kind of way that creates a kind of spectacle conscience or spectacle sort of attitude or perspective on those different people from those different backgrounds. here as well is a book that looks at these issues. And of course, as you can imagine, exoticism and spectacle are things that, like other aspects of culture, that are very evident in the arts. So here's a book called The End of Exoticism, or the infiltration of the other into Western art music. So trying to look at the way in which Western art borrowed from these other kind of cultural perspectives, and the way in which they treated them as other or as exotic, versus trying to create a way of portraying those other traditions kind of as valuable in and of themselves, right? That they don't need necessarily to be grafted on a kind of superior traditional Western music, kinds of traditions, and moving more in the direction of appreciating indigenous, music and culture. You see that to an extent in world music and popular culture, right? Or real early world music, borrowed from other cultural traditions, and I think that was important and valuable because it opened people's minds and their perspectives. But then ultimately, you like that to move to the point of trying to understand those traditional cultures, and again, their music, literature, poetry, dance, etc., more in the terms of things that are made or performed by people from those cultures, to try and understand and appreciate that music from a more authentic kind of perspective, even though sort of as a cultural outsider, you can never understand it completely as somebody who's a part of that culture can understand it, if indeed they were brought up, within that culture. Nonetheless, to try and understand it in a more traditional way. When I was a kid, multicultural education was first starting, and basically what multiculturalism, it was all about exoticism and spectacle. We made totem poles out of paper towel, cardboard, and we learned about Native Americans as though they all, as though they were a monolithic culture. They were all warlike and lived the same kind of way in teepees and everything else. And so we basically, multiculturalism was teaching stereotypes in a way that really did portray Native Americans as very exotic and create a kind of spectacle conscience. More recently, in multicultural perspective, we tried to do that in a way that, again, is more authentic to Native cultures and traditions. And one way to do that is to treat those cultures and traditions in and of themselves, often, again, from the perspective of people who are actually from those different cultures. So this, I think, is, I know this, I kind of went on for a while and talking about some of this background information, but it's really important, not just because it can help you understand Cesare's A Tempest, but it can help you to understand, the larger post-colonial tradition, aspects of postmodernism in the arts today, and aspects of education today, and multiculturalism. You can see how it is sort of broadly applicable. So I wanted to kind of mention that. Some of you might decide to take Hum to, in which case you'll get a lot more of this directly. I know many of you won't. So I just wanted to do that because it really, talking about those issues helps to build a bridge, or show some aspects of the bridge that we create between Hum 1 and Hum 2, kind of historically. So just some things about A Tempest that bring out these themes, these concepts and perspective that Cesare is trying to utilize, right? We also have as a new character Ishu, right, who's is a black devil god, as they are often portrayed, or a trickster god, right? Sort of a new character, very much a comedic kind of character in ways. He's helpful and useful to the people who are respectful of him, right? He does mean nasty things to people who aren't respectful of him. As a contrast to the kind of perspective that we get with some of the kind of spiritual characters in the traditional Tempest, which are often mythological, characters or characters from literature, from Western, tradition of and ideas about divinity, etc. So you see the contrast between the two of those as well, and the conflict between the religion of the natives, in this case, the native, being Caliban, and his kind of indigenous cultural beliefs when it comes to religion versus those of the colonizer, of Prospero and Miranda, etc. There's definitely a more intentional focus on colonization in A Tempest, because when Prospero, when Antonio and Alonso and Sebastian and Ferdinand are out sailing and sighted by Prospero, they're not coming back from marrying off the daughter and trying to find their way back to Italy. They're looking for a secret island or series of islands that supposedly can be great for them to colonize and will make them wealthy. And that supposedly Prospero knew where these were, and the Prospero had escaped to these, to these islands, etc. So the reason that these people are out, and traveling around, was because they had directly colonial intentions. So that's a change made here by Cesaire. In addition to that, I mentioned that Caliban will still keep trying to talk his native language, even when Prospero tells him not to. We're led to think more directly, for example, about the similarities between cave, the word for cave, which is grotto, and the way in which Prospero says the Caliban is living in a ghetto and what that means. And ghetto, the term ghetto comes historically, before we think of ghetto as it's used in this country, to refer to a place that's kind of cordoned off from the rest of a town or a city, where people are kind of forced to live apart from the dominant culture. For example, Jews were put in ghettos in Poland, and, for example, in other places that were where Jews lived that were overrun by the Nazis, before they were eventually moved to concentration camps near the end of the war, whereas we know millions of them were murdered. Before that, a step in that direction was to put them in these ghettos first, and isolate them from the rest of society. There are different takes on, for example, Caliban's supposed attempt to seduce Miranda. Caliban says that he got the idea about trying to do that and about sexuality and so on because of the way he was corrupted, and his mind was corrupted by Prospero. And so there's a difference there, even in Caliban's behavior. I mentioned Caliban calling Ariel and Uncle Tom and saying that he was kowtowing too much to Prospero. Gonzalo has directly colonial intentions in wanting to exploit the island for its cave guano, guano being the refuse created by bats and birds that collects over time, and is indeed a great source of fuel and a raw material that was very valuable at the time. These droppings from bats and birds, and Gonzalo thinks that he can make they can make a lot of money if they do that. He thinks about the native peoples as wondrous animal-like exotic creatures that, again, you would portray as though in a zoo, which is the kind of, if not directly or literally in zoos, the way you present people who are exotic others in things like these Wild West shows. And even you could say minstrel shows did the same thing. At the same time, there's this kind of romanticizing of the native people as the kind of noble savage perspective that can be traced to Rousseau's Romanticism, um, where you romanticize the other um, in a way that is really racist because again it does not it looks at them through a lens of idealism that comes from the dominant culture, and the culture of the colonizer, and again doesn't look at or try to understand or appreciate the indigenous culture sort of in and of itself, and the fact that all cultures, all societies have their goods and their bad sides to them, right? So treating native Indian cultures as if they were all completely peaceful before Europeans came to North America, which was not true. It is true that the Indian wars and wars between Indians um, were increased a great deal as their land was taken from them, and they had to kind of fight for their land. After horses were brought to North America by the Spanish, and made war something that was a lot, in some ways, easier to prosecute, since you could attack your enemy much more quickly and get away from your enemy, etc. But nonetheless, um, to try and appreciate indigenous cultures in all of their facets, and not just through the lens of the culture of the colonized, and even not through an idealized lens, this lens of the noble savage that you see in Rousseau. Let's see, what else do we have here? Gonzalo also, he calls the island a filthy hole. Um, that island is the home of Caliban, right? Um, that's something you also see frequently among colonizers. You see it also during wars when the military from different countries, right, are going to different places and other parts of the world where the geography is radically different, and just seeing those places as just horrible. Who would ever want to live here? Um, um, you see this in the way soldiers looked at Korea and Vietnam after spending time there, for example. Or people who would traveled in Africa on safaris and those kinds of things, because they're seeing things through the lens of their own culture, and they see their own culture as technologically superior, as offering a better way of life, etc. Less likely to see the negatives of their own kind of society, and don't really understand or appreciate that these places are home to these other people, right? They're more likely to appreciate and see the beauty and the positives of the places that are their homes, right? Just like these people from these more quote unquote modern Western nations would. So I think understanding things in terms of those differences can also be helpful. Let's see, what else do we see? I mentioned the way the pagan god Ishu is kind of portrayed as kind of a troublemaker, as a trickster god, versus the sort of the gods of the colonizers, or gods and goddesses. We see the way it's made more overt, the way Stefano and Trinculo tried to use alcohol to subdue Caliban, to try and degrade him, right? If you can degrade the native peoples, you can make them feel like they deserve to be treated as lesser, and reinforce that false consciousness where they think that they deserve to be treated as lesser than the European colonizer who was superior. Caliban calls Prospero anti-nature because Prospero believes in using nature, controlling nature, the way a European would, versus appreciating, understanding nature, seeing themselves as part of nature. It's much more likely to be seen with native cultures, especially hunter-gatherer or early agrarian cultures, who see themselves as a part of nature, respectful of nature, whose religious perspective is much more likely to see them as a part of nature and not as seeing human beings as superior to nature, and nature as something that needs to be controlled and tamed. That you see, and again, it can be reinforced in looking at the story in the Garden of Eden, and the idea that Eden was perfectly safe and willing to give of itself to Adam and Eve until the fall. Then nature became dangerous. Nature became something that needed to be controlled, that could cause pain and suffering, etc. And then at that point, you see nature treated very differently. Once there's that kind of break from nature, you tend not to see that in indigenous cultures in their sort of creation stories. See what else is different here. Gonzalez says Caliban needs an exorcism. Sees him as being controlled by his own religion and his own spirits that are not just different, but evil from the perspective of the Europeans. Caliban calls Prospero and the others addicts. They're addicted to their ideas about conquest and control and power, in a way that ultimately weakens them. And again, you see that at the end of the story, because Prospero has become addicted to being, controlling the island and dominating Caliban, having Caliban as his slave. There's this idea too that you see here, that's prominent when you see white Europeans and indigenous cultures through that colonized perspective. The idea of the white man's burden, that Prospero is actually making a sacrifice in staying on the island and helping to save Caliban, to save his soul, make him Christian, and make him more like other Europeans, right? Give him a European consciousness and language and perspective, and all of those kind of things, that will actually be better for him. So that Prospero is almost like very paternalistically, like he's a father figure in some sense, as somebody from the superior, white Western culture. And again, seeing it that he's actually taking on this burden, and the Caliban ultimately should be thankful for him for doing what he's done, right? And he says, we gave you our religion and other things, of course, overlooking the fact that Caliban taught them how to survive on the island, and they probably would have not survived had they not learned from him where to find clean water and what was edible and what's not edible, all those kinds of things. And then I think we're kind of left at the end here, to wonder what's going to happen after, everybody else leaves the island again. Prospero has been willing to forgive Alonso and Antonio because they're like he is. They may have done something, been nasty to him, but they're his people. They're white Europeans and white European males at that. So he's going to forgive them and overlook what they did. That's not going to be the case for Caliban, right? Even Ariel as a mulatto is going to be treated slightly better than Caliban ultimately is going to be freed. But that's not going to be the case for Caliban. So what happens at the end? We see at the end, Prospero hasn't changed. He still is bound and determined to try and remake Caliban in his image in a way, right? To pacify him, to make him give up his language and religion, to accept Prospero and his culture, and in a way in which he's dependent on Caliban and therefore weak because of that, right? He's really lost his independence. He can only think of himself as the opposite of Caliban. His whole identity is wrapped up in that. right? He can't develop his identity, his sense of purpose in any other way, right? That sort of um, axis, if you will, right? If you think of a circle representing 360 degrees, and you think of a line going through it, and the axis of that line from one end to another, right? At one end, let's say you have Caliban. At the other end, you have Prospero. Prospero is being controlled by the axis of that line, right, through that circle. He can't develop himself following, moving anywhere else along that circle because he is so dependent on Caliban. And I would say Caliban even has more room to move around that 360-degree circle, and not to see himself in opposition to Prospero, because he's recognized what's happened to him, right? And he's ultimately open, if he wants to adapt elements of Prospero's culture if he wants, and maintain the aspects of his culture that he wants. He's got that freedom now, right? So he's not controlled by that single axis, that single line, right, through that 360-degree circle. Prospero is absolutely controlled by seeing himself as the opposite of Caliban as this inferior native individual, right? So what's going to happen at the end after after we leave Prospero and Caliban, right? What does it mean for Caliban to have a kind of freedom that Prospero doesn't have, and vice versa? So something to think about at the end of the story. So I hope you found that helpful, both the background information and this some places in at least in which Cesaire is using some of these kind of post-colonial perspectives and vocabulary and concepts in his rewriting of Shakespeare's The Tempest. Again, hope you find that helpful, especially for those of you who chose the paper topic on this reading. And I hope you enjoy the rest of your week, and I'll see you later.